So we were just finished pointing out that nothing in the recent GOP push against LGBTQ people has any logical standing. Next, we have to ask, why is this happening now? What is the Republicans' endgame? What can we do about it? Can we do anything about it? And why, sweet horse god, why is it always DeSantis and Abbott? Why these two sopping dildos? Except sopping dildos implies they did a good job, so that's too polite. They're more like dusty attic dildos from the 40s that your grandmother tried once but got electrocuted by. You know, the one you found as a kid and used as a lightsaber until your mother intervened? Not pulling from real life or anything, just an imaginative tale about how whenever I watch Star Wars, I think about how sex is evil. I'm fine. It was fine. But that last question, why these two bad dildos, is very easy to answer, and begins to explain why these laws seem so broken. Simply put, thanks to Trump, bigotry is pretty popular right now. It's as big as the hit film Jupiter Ascending. We've talked before at length about how the nascent proto-fascism that was the Trump presidency drew a line in the sand for the conservative movement, and how many Republicans, DeSantis in particular, have realized that the old traditional conservative way of doing things won't cut it anymore. Someone needs to step up and be the new Trump. And since Trump is figuratively and literally melting at the moment, DeSantis is currently in the lead for that position. Similarly, Abbott has been struggling with his popularity among this base of the GOP. And so there's just no easier way to gain points than by beating the dead horse of woke politics. They certainly aren't the only people doing this, but rather the most vocally desperate at the moment. You could argue that this explains why these laws seem so hastily written and legally incoherent, in that the people making them don't actually care what the law says. But it's not that simple. As we mentioned, the Don't Say Gay bill appears to have different wording in its preamble than the actual law, and is extremely vague about the actual age groups affected. This makes it so that depending on the courtroom and lawyers involved, you could actually get different interpretations of the bill. And this is actually the same for a lot of these half-assed laws being introduced. They're often incredibly inconsistent, and that's possibly because conservatives don't even really understand transness well enough to effectively legislate against it. Why, for example, is it legal for doctors to treat kids with human growth hormone to alter their bodies, but a crime for doctors to treat trans kids with estrogen or testosterone? How do these laws affect intersex people or people with hormone imbalances? Are puberty blockers still allowed to treat non-trans children for things like precocious puberty? Where do we draw any of these seemingly arbitrary lines? While it's pretty clear that these lawmakers don't understand the actual science, there are likely other extremely old factors at play. Writing for Slate, law professor Courtney Cahill draws parallels between the current-day attempt to define gender along biological lines and the Jim Crow-era practice of doing the exact same thing, but with race. Cahill looks at Bill HB 935, a piece of anti-trans legislation out of Florida that, while it eventually died in 2021, would have made it a crime for healthcare providers to surgically change the sex of minors. Cahill points out that by defining sex as the biological state of being female or male based on sex organs, chromosomes, and endogenous hormone profiles, and then implicitly defining breasts as a female sex organ by listing a mastectomy as a prohibited act when performed on a minor, HB 935 would have legally made having breasts an essential part of the biological state of being female. Except it wouldn't, obviously. As Cahill says, a cisgender Floridian woman would still be a woman even were she to not have breasts, and gaining breasts through hormones or surgery isn't enough for a trans woman to be legally considered a woman. That requires a legal sex change, which requires a note from your healthcare provider. It's the kind of pulling out the rug trick you can play on conservatives over and over again without them even ever coming up with a satisfactory response. Oh, womanhood is defined by being able to give birth? Are infertile cis women no longer women? Of course not. Oh, womanhood is defined by having a certain amount of testosterone in your blood. What about cis athletes with naturally high T counts? Are they no longer women? Still no? Gee, sure seems like this biological system is just an ad hoc way to exclude trans people, huh? Cahill ties us back to Jim Crow, and to similar attempts from the era to define race via various biological truths, which of course didn't work even a little bit because, as Cahill says, in practice, race regulation showed that legal race wasn't based on biological truths and wasn't absolute. The legal definition of race varied between states. Someone could be colored in Louisiana and white somewhere else. The legal definition of race also varied within states. The same person could be both colored and white depending on the official charge with making that assessment. Jim Crow eventually fell apart under the weight of all of its inconsistencies, and so too, Cahill says, will states' power to legally define sex as a binary between male and female. It's only a matter of time before all of the glaring problems with these bills finally start to cause problems for the conservatives passing them. And thanks to how loosely worded a lot of these laws are, they could easily be used for any purpose, because it's not just how they define sex, but any attempt to turn subjective moral stances into absolutes. In Arizona, for example, they're pushing through a law aimed at limiting sexual content in school library books. It would give parents the right to demand a book get pulled lest the librarian be fired and barred from working in a public school. The original law specifically targeted books that promote the study of sex, sexual preferences, sexual activity, sexual perversion, sex-based classifications, sexual identity, or gender identity. But after scrutiny, a lot of that was eliminated, leaving the official wording of the law to be, quote, "No public school district, public charter school, or public school library shall maintain in its inventory or promote books that make as their primary subject the study of sex, sexual lifestyles, or sexual activity, or books that are of a controversial nature that a reasonable parent or legal guardian would want to know of or approve of prior to their child being exposed to it." And what does that even mean? What books have a primary subject being sexual lifestyles? Does study of sex mean no sex education books? And how do you define what a reasonable parent is and what they'd want to know about these books? It's very clear they were trying to ban books that feature LGBTQ stories, but this new law can be so loosely interpreted so that you could oppose pretty much any book with a romantic storyline. Or rather, it doesn't ban any book if you're targeting books that are primarily about sexual activity. Wouldn't that just ban erotic novels, something that isn't in a school to begin with? At least not the cool ones, of course. It comes down to this, I think. Let's say you have a story about a person asleep who needs to be kissed by a prince in order to break a spell and wake up. If that person is a woman, then that kiss is not sexual. However, if the person is a man and the prince kisses that man, then it is instantly sexual to these people. The existence of gay people automatically makes them think about sexual activity. That's what happens in their little brains, and it's one reason why it's impossible to talk to them about this. Others being they're bigots and liars, but whatever. This is all not to mention that legislating what someone is allowed to learn about or do with their own bodies flies directly in the face of the small government anti-cancel culture narrative Republicans have been attempting to weave for the past many decades. But of course, that's not a new contradiction. The hypocrisy is almost not even worth mentioning. Republicans have always wanted to have their cake and not sell it to a gay couple too. They want Uncle Sam to f*** off and leave everyone alone until it comes to all the things they absolutely want the federal government to dictate, like reproductive rights and marriage equality and, sexy, erotic books about vas deferens and all the goop that lives inside of us. Of course, by hiding behind pedophilia, they can at least try and mask this by wrapping their dry little hate turd in a tortilla of think of the children. And again, this is not a new strategy by any means. In the 1970s and 1980s, right-wing religious figures depicted gay men as depraved predators who groomed or recruited children, and similar rhetoric appeared again in the mid-2000s as Democrats and Republicans alike fought against legalizing gay marriage, something that a lot of politicians and pundits are definitely still against, but have to pretend like they aren't. What I mean is that despite how they tiptoe around it, people like Ron DeSantis and Gregg Abbott and most of the GOP would happily move us back to a time where LGBTQ people had zero rights. It's why, when asked point blank, they often give answers like this.
I don't want any discrimination in Florida. I want people to be able to, live their life, whether you're gay, but also whether you're religious. And I think you should be able to do that, and I don't want them discriminated against as well. So, we're going to have, we got a big diverse state, and that's just the way it is.
Oh yeah, do I think gay people should have rights and be protected? I mean, I think all things should be protected. All words are good, really, and letters that are in the words, did you think about religious people? That's also a word. So to directly answer your question, I think religious people deserve rights. Meanwhile, his actual actions, such as leaving LGBTQ people off of anti-discrimination laws, speak much louder than fumbled words. But they can't just say it anymore. Just like when Ben Shapiro has to claim he's not against gay marriage, but the government getting involved in all marriage.
I think the government ought to be completely out of the business of marriage. I think the government sucks at everything. is my short message for today. The government is terrible at everything. If the government's goal was to forward traditional marriage, it utterly failed, obviously, as proved.
But you don't mind it being out of the business of traditional marriage at all?
No,
right?
I think the government should be out of all marriage.
Ah, yes. All marriage matters or something. Ben is totally cool with gay people. Except coincidentally, whenever the government gets involved with granting them equal rights, and also when someone tweets the word gay, apparently. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that Courtney Cahill's assessment that these laws are similar to Jim Crow laws is pretty apt. I mean, obviously there are many historical differences, and I'm not going to compare them one to one. But the Jim Crow era began roughly 10 years after slavery was abolished, and the laws were enacted mainly in southern states. In retrospect, they really seem like a last-ditch attempt to maintain the power dynamics of slavery, labeling non-white individuals as second class and proclaiming honky superiority. I can't stress enough that racial segregation and history can't really be compared to LGBTQ rights, but you can't help but see the similarity. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.